Hey guys, welcome back. Aura here. In this video we're going to be going over that Plaguefall I mentioned yesterday in the legendary comparison video, with slight change in terms of the DPS that were present, but Saito is running the same build as me this time. So DR Legendary with Execution Sentence, Final Reckoning and Imperium Power. So again, this video is pulled off my stream, so it's saved on there as well if you want to go through it slowly. But let's get into the bulk of it. So let's just play this normally. The play speed is set to 1 and the quality is good, hopefully. So set it to source. There we go. Right. So the key stats, no real problems to speak of. We did find out that the anima power toy that you can get that increases your size enables you to actually mount something else. But the buff is then immediately removed when you dismount. So it can be quite funny if you get on a longboy or something of that nature. So you've got me and Saito both bursting, doing our usual thing. Saito's burst is a lot faster than mine. Because I was a little bit slower on the upkeep, and I believe playing this, I'm one playstyle difference between Saito and myself. I am much more likely to Templar's Verdict priority targets, whereas Saito will default to using Divine Storm in any 2+ situation. So his Divine Storm usage over a dungeon is much higher than mine. Whereas I do focus primarily on pumping the single target damage when I can. So with that previous pack, I was trying my best to just focus on blowing up the big guy, whereas Saito was still hitting Divine Storms. But again, this is kind of where Saito's experience as a Retribution Paladin will start to eclipse my own. So you get to see kind of the performance difference. Whereas at the end of the 18 Spires of Ascension, I soundly beat him on DPS despite him using the AoE legendary. The affixes are the same as well, and although this is a slightly lower key being a 15, at the end you will see the scale of difference that the legendary made on his part in relation to where we both stand. So as things have stood so far, I have actually yet to beat him on a fight, because he is soundly beating my DPS at the moment. I am holding certain cooldowns because we're about to go up to a Tormentor, but Saito's abilities are out by about 30 seconds. In hindsight, I should have hit wings here because it would have been back in time for the boss. And this is something I needed to practice on farm keys or weekly keys, is not holding wings as often as I do. Because had I have used it at the start on this Tormentor, it would be up in time for the boss. But Saito's holding his cooldowns for the next pack. And I believe, also, in this dungeon, Saito also chose the double Champion's brand, like we discussed. So, the main bits of interest will actually be the bosses and the end results. So you've got Saito popping everything here. I popped my wings and my cooldowns as well, and Saito soundly hit 36.4k, whereas I only hit 21. So Saito did a much better job in that AoE pack than I did. And without cooldowns, I am doing slightly better than he is. Still needs a bit of positional work on my part. benefit of having multiple monks, we get a few touch of deaths. And it does make Golbgrog much easier. Because one interesting point to note going into this boss, the ads that he spawns, the large smorgasbords, because they're aberrations, you can turn evil as a paladin, so you can put them into a 40-second fear. Now, it's not really required when you have two monks that can paralyze them, but there are situations and dungeons I have done where my turn evil has been required. Usually, they're in fights where things aren't quite going to plan. Now, both Saito and I are holding for our cooldowns, so we were a little bit slow off the mark, but now we've both popped. Here we go. Now, there is something that I kind of wanted to highlight in the way that our burst profiles work. You can see our burst and our damage at the moment now is pretty much even. There's essentially a crit in it between the two of us, but Saito's burst was a lot faster off the mark, and this is because he has more haste naturally than I do. Because my haste and the way my gearing has kind of turned out, I don't have as much haste off the bat. I'm using the Warrior's Old Soul, which is the Sylvanas trinket, which is a ramping haste amp trinket while you're in combat. Which means that to start with, if I was to burst on pull, I don't actually have the 21.5% haste that you actually need. Or rather, is beneficial. Whereas Saito does, because he doesn't have those trinkets. So you can see me inspect. So if I pause it for a second, Saito's running the DR Legendary, like I am, and he's using the Overwhelming Power Crystal from the other side, and he's using Vial of Putrefaction, which you can get from Plaguefall. Now, Vial of Putrefaction is a fantastic single target passive trinket. But the problem with that trinket is it doesn't constantly reapply itself when it's single target. It will drop off. But in AoE situations, you'll end up doing, like, you'll put one stack on one mob, one stack on another, and then the third stack might go on to one of those two, or it might go on to a third target. You never know, because it's the next hit you do. Which is fine, and it's a fantastically serviceable trinket and is still very, very good for Retribution Paladins. I think if you were to look on certain sites and certain classifications, if you wanted to be classified, it'd come under as A+, in terms of passive trinkets we can use. So the better side of the A bracket, but it's not S tier. If you wanted quote-unquote S tier trinkets, you'd be looking at Old Warrior's Soul, because it does give about 6% haste once it's fully stacked out. And if you're pulling appropriately Mythic Plus, you will have that haste consistently. There are certain points where it will drop, like running from a boss into the next pack, now being a good example, or the periods in the other side when you've killed, say, Hakar, and you've got to run out of Hakar's wing to do the next bit. But you can still get a really good portion of that haste throughout the dungeon, which allows me to have much more mastery. So the end result of Golbgrog was I pulled 744,000 damage at 7.5k DPS, and Saito did 709k damage with an average of 7.2k DPS. And that difference can be down to that difference in stats and me having more mastery. So with me having more mastery, a lot of my abilities hit harder, they just hit slower. The exception for that, though, and this is an interesting thing, is because my quantum inscrutable device will give me mastery or haste based on when I use it. Now, as I was discussing previously, if I use Seraphim before using it, it will almost always give me mastery, which is fantastic. But what Overwhelming Power Crystal does is it gives you a huge amount of crit. I believe in one of my gearing guides for 9.1, I discussed the fact that at my current gear, even a baseline, a mythic 0, so I think it's 220 Overwhelming Power Crystal will almost double my crit. And then when you pair that with wings, because you will just macro it into wings and you will use it every time you wings, you'll get your 20% additional crit from wings plus the stat amp from the trinket. So Saito, I believe, seeing as his is a 252 overwhelming, he can hit about 60 or 70% crit during wings. So his initial burst during wings is really high, and he has a really bursty build. But as you can see, like as things progress, his sustain isn't quite there, but he does slap harder than I do, at least to start. And this is kind of where the discussion between Retribution Paladin gearing kicks in. So we'll continue the video. And you've got me assisting in dispels. You can see how you mouse over dispel there, just to help with trying to manage those diseases. Yes, monks can get rid of diseases, but sometimes they can be doing something else, or they can be trying to set up for something. And if you're just proactive with these little things, you can help the group quite a bit. It becomes a lot more useful on instances like Margrave Stradama, the final boss of this dungeon, when she does Infectious Rain. If you know that you can soak it yourself, rather than dispelling myself, I've got a couple of 16 Plaguefalls that I can also review if you guys want, where the comp is, again, different. I believe in one of them we had a warrior. So obviously warriors have no self-healing, and they have no real defensives outside of ignore pain, swapping to defensive stance, but I don't think PvE arms warriors hit defensive stance now, because it's a DPS it's a damage reduction for them. Dispel him and Shield of Vengeance myself, which keeps the group alive and keeps us going. But anyway, so Saito is, yeah, actually this is a point I want to make, and I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see it particularly well, but I'm holding on to wings. I have Divine Toll and Final Reckoning available, whereas Saito doesn't. Saito used his. And this is where the experience comes in, because Saito is much better at using his cooldowns throughout the dungeon and pretty much uses them on cooldown, which is, you know, fantastic and what you should do. Whereas I am consciously, and it might be partially because of the way I think and the way my build works, I am consciously trying to think, what is the priority target I should be hitting? So, like, I've popped wings for this particular pack, and yeah, I'm doing 14k DPS in comparison to Tame's 3k DPS. Oh, I popped off and I killed that target. But Saito's about to get his cooldowns back, or he's about to get his minutes back, and I've got about another 30 seconds on mine. So we're kind of leapfrogging our abilities, which is good. In some groups, especially higher groups, you want that. You don't all want to be popping on the same packs. You kind of want to keep rolling your cooldowns. But from a Retribution Paladin perspective, to keep this fair, I personally need to improve on my cooldown usage, because there are points where I could probably squeeze in another wings over the course of a dungeon, and given how much damage I can do during my wings window, that might actually be the difference in like some of the 18s. Like, I've got a 19 Sanguine Depths to review as well for you guys. If I used my wings more often, then maybe we could have timed it, because unfortunately the Sanguine Depths wasn't timed. A few mistakes, but again, there's a few points of the Sanguine Depths key that is on, again, TikTok, because I kind of use TikTok for my highlights reel. But yeah, so another benefit of me doing these reviews for you guys and kind of talking through them is I can look at them myself and see where I need to improve, and hopefully I can continue to give you guys better content. So because we know this next pack's a bit of a problem, both Saito and I are actually holding our cooldowns. We're both going to try and blow this next pack up. So, by the way, if any of you want what I use to track these cooldowns on the party frames, I will let you, like, I can put it in the description below. Just comment below and I'll add it to my list of things. So you can see here that because Saito's popped his wings, he's actually higher than me for the time being. But I then start catching him when things become a little bit more hectic. He still beat me for that pull, though. And part of that reason is because of having that amount of crit going into your initial opener. Because the thing is with with Retribution Paladin damage, is a part of it is very front loaded. But then, and by front loaded I mean it happens in the first 2 or 3 seconds. But what differentiates good paladins from the average paladins is whether or not you can take those 2 or 3 seconds and stretch them out for 8 seconds. Because while stretching them out for 8 seconds into your execution sentence and your final reckoning debuff on the target, you're then extending your burst, essentially. Whereas some other paladins, or people newer to the class, might shy away from execution sentence and just try and front load their damage in the first 2-3 seconds and then drop off because they don't need to try and push. Because remember, execution sentence stores 20% of the damage you deal to all targets, or to that target, and then puts it in at the last bit. You can, which is kind of beneficial. But here is, if I remember correctly, this particular mob's about to die, and I almost instantly dispel. If it's not this dungeon, it will be in the 16 that I did. Because the disease from these plague borers are nasty. There we are, that's on stage, and I dispel. And I dispel fast enough that the life cocoon that Time on his monk put out didn't actually take any damage. It didn't break. So, yeah, benefits of having a mouse over dispel. Because I believe, well, again, if you want to watch this on Twitch, you can hear the voice comms for it. I believe, if memory serves, that Time couldn't actually dispel that because he'd dispelled somebody else for a disease. So, if I hadn't dispelled when I had, Stitch would have probably died. Both Saito and I have cooldowns for this next bit, and I believe we're both going to pop them for the Executioner. So, yeah, this is a tactic you'll see quite common during this second season, because what you want is you want to go kill the Executioner using your cooldowns and whatever, get the second DPS increasing anima power, and then clear the ads. Saito held his wings here, weirdly enough. So I don't know if his wings, if he just didn't pop his wings or he thought to hold them. But you can see even without popping wings, his 1 minute internal, or his 1 minute build, is still now able to pump out a lot more damage than it did in the 18. Because he's able to make use of the extra judgments. Because this is one of the big reasons why Divine Resonance is so good for us. Is because it's not just the damage that you get from the extra 3 judgments. It's the fact that you're getting the free judgment debuff. So you're hitting something 20% harder, and being able to properly manage that for the 15 seconds after a Divine Toll is huge. And if you can play the minigame, which is picking up the souls to increase your mastery after it, obviously your judgments are benefiting from that increased mastery if you extend its duration. So you can try and keep Pelagos's combat mastery buff for the 15 seconds. Now, obviously, purple is the primary target because it's the damage everything else takes. And we just go to town. Having a couple of range problems there. I try and kite out, because one thing about those purple mobs when they leap, they always leap onto the tank, but the icon to say who they're going to leap onto isn't always the tank. So it can be very confusing, and in the past I have been one-shot by them. Because I've stood on the tank thinking that, you know, it's about to jump to the priest or whatever, and oh yeah, this is my first time trying to do this, and it kind of cocks up a bit, and it got a little bit close to blowing up, so need to improve on that. But basically what you can do is you can pick those vials up and throw them into the poison, and during the Dr. Icarus encounter, if he jumps to that platform and summons an ad, the ad is easier to kill, but the time in which you have to kill it is shorter. So you have to dedicate the time to smacking it. Else it can actually be a handicap. So it's kind of one of those things where as a group, are you more confident or not? Now, I have my cooldowns from the start, so I just blow up. Saito's just used his 1 minute, and his wings comes up in 40 seconds. Couple of 20k Templars verdicts there. Now, Saito, like, the three of us go to town on this. I believe I get hit here, so I just end up trying to not be an idiot. I think that was a word of glory on myself there. You can see that Stitch has paralyzed the purple ad away from Dr. Icarus, so we can actually just do full damage and not have to worry about having to kill it. It kind of speeds this fight up a bit. Again, those congealed slimes, because they're aberrations, you can, if you want, turn evil them, but turn evil does break on damage quite easily, so you need to either be very quick or you need to have it discussed with your group beforehand. Now, my minutes have come back up, so I'm going to use them on the Plague Bomb. I turn to get my extra strength, and we just go to town. I moved into that, thinking I was safe, when I wasn't. Now, this is something you can see that's a problem with the RNG. Unfortunately, the platform I used the purple thing on, he didn't actually jump to, so it was wasted time. You have Stitch kiting the purple thing away, and just letting the paladins kind of do their job. Or at least trying to. And it's coming back in. Is Stitch going to power it in time? No, he's not. Leaps, leaps, and more leaps. Stitch goes down, and it's fine. Now we rapidly approach the fun bit. We have a pack, and then we have the joke. So, basic. Apologies. So, obviously I racial the debuff from the gushing slime, just so it doesn't drop a huge giant pool on the floor, because we're already having to deal with sanguine, which isn't fun, but it's fine. Stitch does a cracking job of racial in that. You can see I'm kind of ignoring my minigame, and I just let it despawn. I should really try and get a weak aura for that, but anyway, here we go. Two paladins walk into a bar. I pre-bubble to avoid threat. Tame bubbles there as well. Wake of Ashes to stun everything, into a leg sweep, and we just go to town. I very nearly break the 40k AoE mark. And remember, this is using Divine Resonance. If I had Tempest the Lightbringer on, I could have probably hit 40k. But it isn't needed. And that's the big part of it. And Saito himself also pulled 20, nearly 30k DPS which is on par with what he was pulling in the larger pulls for that Spires of Ascension. But between the two of us, doing nearly 50 to, well, doing between 50 and 60k DPS to a pack. Bunch of very unhappy undeads. Stormy tried being proactive. Unfortunately, Saito did kick that enveloped webbing, which means we now have stealthlings to deal with. Not the worst thing in the world, but generally for these brood ambushes, as a point of note for the dungeon, let the enveloped webbing go out, because it is just a route. So, especially if you're a paladin, you can break it with Blessing of Freedom. But if you let it cast and channel the cast, it won't summon the stealthlings. Which means you don't have to kind of dive out and put yourself in a position where you're trying to stun or CC. One thing to say on that, though, is if you do have to AoE CC, Blinding Light is fantastic here. And realistically is something I should be running more often, but when I'm usually running these dungeons, I've literally just come out of raid, so I'm still kind of in the default raid build. Like, I'll occasionally remember to swap to Imperium Power, but I did a 16 Plaguefall Wednesday, I think it was. It was either Wednesday or Thursday this week. So fortified week, and I completely forgot to use Imperium Power. I was literally running raid build. So I just doubled down on the single target stuff. Again, if you kind of want to see how that looks, I can put that video up, no problem. As just an alternative, like, this is what happens if you don't have Imperium Power. Benefit of a monk, leg sweep. Now, there comes a point, I believe... no, it's not this Plaguefall. But there's a Plaguefall where I managed, like, as they're leaping to me, I bubble. It was big burning play. And... we good. We kushti. Tem is a little bit slow on the wings, because he still had his. But he's doing the work now. Unfortunately, that is one of the biggest problems with this boss, with Domina. As a paladin, if you go to pop your cooldowns, especially if you have Execution Sentence or Final Reckoning on the target, and then she decides you're the one that's getting slapped, if you don't bubble it, you're in for deep trouble. Now, you see there, I bubble there. So, if you're going to pop your cooldowns later and not instantly on pull, what you need to do is you need to wait for that first one to come out. Wait for it to come out, get stunned, then go in, then burst. Otherwise, you can end up in that situation like Saito was, and I have been in multiple times before, where Execution Sentence ticking down, and I can't actually put any damage into the boss because I'm nowhere near it. One big downside of Execution Sentence, in my opinion. But then again, it's the curse of being melee. You can see here, though, Saito has pulled his DPS up. He's been able to go to town. He's been able to do that work. I believe he got an AoE Final Reckoning in, which is a considerable amount of damage, whereas mine was a single target. Because you can do a considerable amount of damage if you hold your cooldowns for Final Reckoning when all the ads are stacked up. It makes Blood Death Knights and Vengeance Demon Hunters our best friends, especially with things like Chains. Chains and Mass Grip. But, yeah, no, as like, again, you can kind of see this. Like, Saito is very, very good when Wings is up, and does a considerable amount of damage, and is doing more damage than he did with Tempest. But because I have more mastery, my sustain is better. So we finished that fight. I did 1,000 more DPS than he did. Overall data, however, as was quickly glanced there, Saito was actually ahead of me by a reasonable margin. So if we go back a smidge, and so yeah, finish that fight. I've done 1.01 million damage, and at 7.8k DPS, Saito has done 889k damage to the boss with an average of 6.8k DPS. But just as we're about to jump in this hole, I check overall data, and I'll pause it when I do it. Overall, there. So overall data, Saito Stitch as the Windwalker Monk has done 9.14 million damage with an average DPS of 6.9k. Saito is then next, having done 8.97 million damage with an average of 6.8k DPS, and I am pulling up the rear at 8.44 million damage and 6.4k DPS overall, which means that so far at this point, Saito has managed to essentially flip the lead that I had in that Spires of Ascension. So whereas I was ahead of him by 300 DPS, he's now ahead of me by 400 DPS. So has managed to gain that 700 DPS-ish by swapping Legendary. And there are places where you could argue that Tempest the Lightbringer would be better in Plaguefall than Spires. But as that pack proved that we went into, and Tame and I pulled 50k DPS between us, it's really not needed. Now, here our Guardian Druid just had fun. Convoke with Boomy Affinity and Heart of the Wild enabled him to pull 20 odd k DPS, and we just let him have fun. Stitch was popping cooldowns here to try and catch him towards the end, but Saito and I were just sat on everything. We didn't see the point. Because at the end of the day, if you've got a Guardian Druid that is running this and is still Nightfare rather than Venthia, because I know Venthias are quite popular at the moment for Druids now, they can do a lot of damage if you give them the space for it. Like, you could arguably coordinate and let them single target burst with the Convoke by pre-bubbling, taunting the boss, pulling it out of range, and then just letting them cast. But I believe when Stormy's in boss fights and uses Convoke, he either uses it defensively or just feral threat. Now, Saito and I are just wrestling for the burst window at this point, with me just holding out. And then Saito pulls ahead the moment there's 2 targets and he can crit more. Because this is one thing in terms of the stat weights that I kind of want to discuss. Haste for both of us is paramount. The way we get our haste is slightly different. So Saito has his 21.5% haste just passively on his gear, and then augments that with his crit. Through his crit trinkets and stuff like that. Whereas I have gone more mastery heavy. So my sustain is better, but my burst is actually weaker. But that's because I'm trying to combat the biggest weakness that Ret Paladins have, and that is our sustain. We're fantastic at bursting anyway, and crits aren't always the most reliable things. Don't get me wrong, if you could get yourself to 100% crit while Wings was up, I'd say go for it. Because you are going to hit like a dumpster truck, and it's not really going to matter. But if I could hit 100% mastery 90-ish% of the time, my sustained DPS would be a lot higher as well, because pretty much everything in a Retribution Paladin's kit does holy damage. So you can see here that Saito is about 600 DPS ahead of me and 50k damage ahead as well. And we're about to go into our second burst window. And here's the end result. I managed to pip to the post at the very, very end in terms of overall damage for the dungeon through that boss and through the sustain components of that boss due to my gearing. But the difference was nigh on negligible, because the DPS difference between us throughout the entire course of the dungeon was only 200 DPS. And I think that comes down to gear at that point. Because remember, there's about 4 item level difference between myself and Saito. So 200 DPS and maybe 2 or 3 crits different in it. Because I finished the dungeon on 7.03 million damage, and Saito finished on 6.84 million damage. And that is 200k damage for a Retribution Paladin is, well, I'd say maybe a 1-minute burst window, if that. Because as you were seeing me, I'm getting 15k Templar's Verdict crit, like normally, and then 20k crit. And I don't know what Saito's average is. If it's of something of interest to you, I can probably see about getting Saito to sit on a target dummy with me for a bit, and we can compare how things hit. The last time I did it, the difference between crit and mastery would be Saito's execution sentence would average about 42,000 damage when he got his out, whereas mine would average 49 to 50. And that's because of the mastery more than anything else. But his crits would be more frequent. So whereas he'd get, say, 40% Templar's Verdict crit, I'd only get, say, 13. Or rather, he'd get 40 crits and I'd get 13 crits within a period of time. So, yeah. The end result then. Saito, by swapping to Divine Resonance and joining the Priority Club, he pulled his average DPS up a few hundred and closed the gap between himself and me in terms of overall DPS for a dungeon from the gap it was to now what can only be, well, around, we'll say around 200 DPS, because 6.4 and 6.2 still leaves a bit. Like, he could have been 6.29 or 2.4 rather, and it's rounded down, and I could be 6.38 and it's rounded up. So the variance is quite small at this point, and I think is down to gear. Because, as I said, up until the final boss, up until Margrave Stradama, he was beating me soundly by quite a gap, by that 400 DPS. So, yeah. Interesting stuff. We will monitor Tame's improvement, and myself as well. So hopefully we can get to a point where the skill is on par, and then we can get a proper representation of the two. But hopefully you guys have liked this, and also the Plaguefall review helps you guys. If there's anything else you want me to add, or would like me to change going forward, please do comment below and let me know what you think. Alternatively, if you liked the video, please hit it with a like and a subscribe. I will catch you all in the next one, folks. Take care, and thanks again.